It was just a 1901 family portrait. But the child's hand reveals something chilling. The attic of the old Baltimore townhouse had not been touched in decades. Dust particles danced in the pale afternoon light that filtered through a grimy window, illuminating forgotten trunks and boxes stacked haphazardly against the wooden beams. Rebecca Miller had postponed this task for months, but the estate sale was scheduled for next week, and she could no longer avoid sorting through her late grandmother's belongings. She moved methodically through the clutter, separating items into piles: keep, donate, discard. Most of it was exactly what she expected: outdated clothing, moth-eaten linens, books with crumbling spines. Then her hand brushed against something solid wrapped in yellowed newspaper. She carefully peeled back the layers to reveal a heavy wooden frame. The photograph inside stopped her cold. It was a formal family portrait, the kind popular at the turn of the century. The image showed a stern-looking couple seated in ornate chairs, the man with a thick mustache and dark suit, the woman in a high-necked dress with her hair pulled severely back. Standing between them were 3 children, 2 blonde girls in matching white dresses, and a young boy in a sailor suit. But it was the 5th child that made Rebecca's breath catch. Off to the side, slightly separated from the others, stood a black child who appeared to be around 8 years old. His clothing was simpler than the others, his expression more guarded. While the white children gazed confidently at the camera, this boy's eyes held something else: fear, perhaps, or resignation. Rebecca brought the photograph closer to the window, squinting at the faded sepia tones. That was when she noticed it, the detail that would haunt her for weeks to come. The boy's right hand was positioned strangely at his side, and as she looked more carefully, she could see the faint outline of what appeared to be a scar encircling his wrist. Not just a scar, a deliberate mark, like rope burn that had healed over time. Her grandmother had never mentioned this photograph. In fact, she had never spoken about her family's history before 1920, always deflecting questions with vague answers and uncomfortable silences. Rebecca turned the frame over, hoping to find names or a date. On the back, written in faded ink, were only 4 words: The Thornton Family, 1901. She pulled out her phone and photographed the image, her hands trembling slightly. Something about this portrait felt wrong, disturbing in a way she could not quite articulate. The boy's expression, the scar on his wrist, the way he stood apart from the others, it all suggested a story that someone had wanted to bury. As the afternoon light faded, Rebecca sat on an old trunk, the portrait resting on her knees. She knew she should continue with the sorting, but she could not look away from that child's face. Who was he? Why was there a scar on his wrist? And why had her grandmother hidden this photograph away for so many years? Rebecca could not sleep that night. The image of the boy's scarred wrist kept appearing behind her closed eyelids, accompanied by questions that multiplied with each passing hour. By dawn, she had made a decision. She needed to know the truth about that photograph, regardless of what she might discover. She began her investigation the way anyone would in 2024, online. She searched census records, genealogy databases, and historical archives, looking for information about the Thornton family in Baltimore around 1901. The results were frustratingly sparse. She found birth records for 3 children born to Harold and Constance Thornton between 1890 and 1895, Margaret, Elizabeth, and Charles. No mention of a 4th child, black or otherwise. The absence itself was telling. On her lunch break from her job at the hospital, Rebecca drove to the Maryland Historical Society. The building was a stately structure on Monument Street, its halls lined with portraits of Baltimore's prominent families. She requested access to city directories and newspaper archives from the turn of the century. The librarian, an elderly woman named Mrs. Patterson, brought her several leather-bound volumes. The Thorntons, you said? That is a name I have not heard in quite some time. Rebecca looked up sharply. You know the family. Mrs. Patterson adjusted her glasses. Not personally, dear, but I have been working here for 43 years. You develop a sense of which families prefer to keep their histories private. The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Rebecca spent the next 3 hours poring over city directories. She found Harold Thornton listed as a textile merchant with an address on Mount Vernon Place, one of Baltimore's most exclusive neighborhoods in that era. His business appeared to have been quite successful, with advertisements appearing regularly in the Baltimore Sun. But it was an obituary from 1923 that made her pause. Harold Thornton died at age 68, survived by his wife Constance and 3 children. The obituary praised his business acumen and charitable works, but mentioned nothing about his family life beyond the bare facts. 3 children, not 4. Rebecca photographed the obituary with her phone, her mind racing. Someone had deliberately erased that boy from the family record. The question was why, and what had happened to him. As she left the Historical Society, the autumn wind cut through her jacket. The city around her, with its modern cars and smartphones, felt surreal compared to the world she had been researching. She imagined Baltimore in 1901, horse-drawn carriages, gas lamps, rigid social hierarchies, and somewhere in that world, a black child with scarred wrists stood beside a white family in a photographer's studio. That evening, Rebecca called her mother in Florida. "Mom, did Grandma ever mention the name Thornton?" There was a long pause. "Why are you asking about that?" The tension in her mother's voice was unmistakable. "I found a photograph in the attic, a family portrait from 1901. Another pause, longer this time. "Rebecca, some things are better left in the past. Mom, there was a child in the photo, a black child with scars on his wrists. I need to know who he was." Her mother's voice became almost a whisper. "Your grandmother made me promise never to talk about it. She said it would only bring pain." "It is too late for that," Rebecca said firmly. "The pain is already here." 3 days later, Rebecca sat in her mother's living room in Clearwater, having taken emergency leave from work. The flight from Baltimore had given her time to prepare herself for whatever truth awaited, but nothing could have readied her for the weight of what she was about to learn. Her mother, Catherine, looked older than Rebecca remembered. She sat in her armchair by the window, hands folded tightly in her lap, staring at the photograph Rebecca had brought. "His name was Thomas," Catherine finally said, her voice barely audible. "At least, that is what they called him. We do not know what his real name was." Rebecca leaned forward, every muscle tense. "Tell me everything." Catherine took a deep breath. "Your great-great-grandfather, Harold Thornton, was not the charitable businessman his obituary claimed. In 1901, more than 35 years after slavery was abolished, there were still people who refused to let it go. They found ways around the law." "What do you mean?" "Children, Rebecca. Black children who had been orphaned or whose parents had died or disappeared. Some men, wealthy men, would take these children under the guise of apprenticeship or domestic service, but it was not service. It was slavery by another name." The room seemed to tilt. Rebecca gripped the arm of the sofa. "Harold Thornton kept a slave? In 1901? Not just kept, bought. From a man in rural Virginia who ran what he called an orphanage. Your grandmother told me this when I was 18, made me swear never to repeat it. She said the shame of it had eaten at her for 70 years. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. "Thomas was brought to the Thornton house when he was 6 years old. He was kept in the servants' quarters, made to work from dawn until late at night. Cleaning, cooking, tending the horses, whatever they needed. He was not allowed to leave the property. He was not allowed to learn to read. And those scars on his wrists. From chains," Rebecca whispered, horror washing over her. "From rope," Catherine corrected. "They would tie him when they left the house to ensure he could not run away. By the time he was 8, the marks were permanent." Rebecca felt sick. "Why is he in the family portrait, then? If they were hiding him?" "That is where the story becomes different," Catherine said, wiping her eyes. "That photograph was not supposed to exist. At least, not like that." She stood and retrieved a small wooden box from her bedroom. Inside were several yellowed letters, their edges crumbling with age. "These belong to your great-great-grandmother, Constance. Your grandmother kept them hidden for decades." Rebecca unfolded the first letter carefully. The handwriting was elegant but shaky, as though written in great distress. "My dearest sister," it began, "I can no longer bear the weight of this sin. Harold insists it is legal that we are providing the boy with food and shelter, but I know in my soul that what we are doing is wrong. I see the fear in Thomas's eyes. I see the marks on his wrists. At night, I hear him crying in his room, and my heart breaks, knowing my own children sleep safely while this child suffers." Rebecca looked up, her vision blurred with tears. She knew it was wrong. "She did more than know," Catherine said quietly. "She acted." Rebecca read through the letters with trembling hands, each one revealing more of Constance Thornton's inner torment. The correspondence spanned several months in 1901, addressed to her sister Harriet, who lived in Philadelphia. March 15th, 1901. "Dearest Harriet, I have begun teaching Thomas his letters in secret. When Harold is at the textile exchange and the other children are at school, I bring Thomas into the library. He is remarkably bright. He learned the alphabet in just 2 weeks, but I live in constant fear that Harold will discover us. Last Tuesday, he came home unexpectedly and nearly caught us. Thomas had to hide behind the curtains, holding his breath, while Harold retrieved some papers from his desk. I am terrified, sister. Not for myself, but for Thomas. If Harold found out, I do not know what he would do to the boy." Rebecca's mother brought her tea, but it sat untouched as Rebecca continued reading. The next letter was dated a month later, April the 22nd, 1901. "The situation has become unbearable. Last night, I heard Harold beating Thomas in the stable. The boy had apparently broken a harness while cleaning it. An accident, nothing more. But Harold was furious. I rushed out to stop him. And for the first time in our 18 years of marriage, I stood up to my husband. I told him that what he was doing was evil, that keeping this child in bondage, beating him, denying him an education and a future, it was no different than the slavery our nation had fought a war to end. Harold struck me, Harriet. He has never raised a hand to me before. He called me a fool and a traitor to our race. He said Thomas was property. that I had no right to interfere with his business affairs. I made my decision in that moment. I'm going to free Thomas, with or without Harold's permission. Rebecca looked at her mother, her voice thick with emotion. How did she do it? Catherine pulled out another document. This one was not a letter but a legal paper, brittle and faded. This is a notarized statement from a lawyer named Joseph Brennan, dated June 1901. Constance went to him in secret. Rebecca read the document. It was a formal declaration stating that Thomas, described as a minor child of approximately 8 years of age, was being held unlawfully by Harold Thornton, and that Constance Thornton was seeking legal intervention to secure the child's freedom. But this would have been scandalous, Rebecca said. A woman going against her husband, admitting publicly that they had been holding a child illegally? It would have destroyed them, Catherine agreed. Constance knew that. She did not care anymore. The next letter revealed Constance's plan in detail. She had contacted a network of Quaker families in Pennsylvania who were known to help displaced black children. They had agreed to take Thomas, provide him with education, and help him build a new life. June 3rd, 1901. Tomorrow, we will have our family portrait taken. Harold insists upon it. He wants to project the image of a proper, successful Baltimore family. He has no idea that I have made arrangements with the photographer, Mr. William Ashford, who is sympathetic to our cause. Thomas will be in the photograph. Harold would never have agreed to it, but Mr. Ashford and I have planned this carefully. When Harold and the children arrive at the studio, Thomas will already be positioned in the frame. By the time Harold realizes what is happening, the photograph will be taken. This will be my proof, Harriet. Proof that Thomas existed, that he was part of our household, that we kept a child in bondage. If Harold tries to stop me from freeing Thomas, I will take this photograph to the authorities. Rebecca sat back, overwhelmed. She blackmailed her own husband. She saved a child's life, Catherine corrected gently. Rebecca found herself imagining that day in June 1901, reconstructing it from the letters and the photograph itself. She could almost see it unfolding. The photographer's studio on Charles Street, the morning light filtering through tall windows, the smell of developing chemicals hanging in the air. Catherine handed her another letter, this one written hurriedly, the ink smudged in places. June 4th, 1901. Evening. It is done, Harriet. The photograph exists, and Thomas is free. This morning unfolded exactly as I had feared and hoped. I arrived at Mr. Ashford's studio an hour before Harold, bringing Thomas with me. The boy was terrified. He had never left the house except to run errands nearby, and the idea of being photographed alongside the family clearly frightened him. I held his hand as we entered the studio. Mr. Ashford positioned him carefully, off to the side but clearly visible in the frame. When Harold arrived with Margaret, Elizabeth, and Charles, his face turned purple with rage. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "Get that boy out of here immediately." But Mr. Ashford, bless him, stood firm. "Sir, your wife commissioned this portrait to include all members of your household. The positioning has been carefully arranged. If you would like the photograph, everyone must remain as they are." Rebecca could picture the scene, Harold Thornton trapped between his pride and his fury. A man of his social standing would have paid handsomely for a formal family portrait. To storm out over the inclusion of a black child would have raised questions he could not afford to answer. The letter continued. Harold had no choice but to proceed. He sat rigidly, his jaw clenched so tightly I thought his teeth might crack. Our children looked confused. They rarely saw Thomas, and when they did, they had been taught to ignore him. But there they stood, all together in that studio, captured forever in silver and light. When the flash powder ignited, Thomas flinched so hard he nearly ran. I reached out and steadied him, my hand on his shoulder. Mr. Ashford captured that moment too, though I doubt Harold noticed. After the sitting, Harold grabbed my arm and pulled me aside. "You will regret this," he hissed. "The photograph will never see the light of day." "It already has," I told him. "Mr. Ashford has made copies. One is being held by my lawyer, Joseph Brennan. If anything happens to Thomas, if you prevent me from helping him, those copies will be delivered to the police commissioner and the Baltimore Sun." I have never seen such hatred in a man's eyes, Harriet. Not even the hatred was for Thomas. It was all directed at me, his wife, who had dared to defy him. Rebecca looked at the photograph again, seeing it with new understanding. The separation between Thomas and the other children was not just physical. It was the vast distance between captivity and freedom, between cruelty and compassion. "What happened next?" she asked her mother. Catherine's expression softened. Constance kept her word. Within a week, she had arranged for Thomas to be taken to Pennsylvania. But getting him out of Baltimore was far more dangerous than anyone had anticipated. The June heat was oppressive as Constance finalized her plans. She could not simply put Thomas on a train. Harold had connections throughout Baltimore, and any attempt to leave the city openly would be stopped immediately. She needed help from people who understood the underground routes that had once helped escaped slaves reach freedom. Through her lawyer, Joseph Brennan, Constance made contact with a man named Elijah Warren. Elijah was in his 60s, a former conductor on the Underground Railroad who had never stopped helping those who needed passage to safer places. Though the railroad had officially ended decades earlier, men like Elijah maintained networks for situations exactly like this. June 10th, 1901. Dearest Harriet, I met with Elijah Warren yesterday in a small church in Fells Point. He is a remarkable man, dignified, careful, and utterly committed to what he calls finishing the work. He told me that even in 1901, there are still children who need to be moved quietly, still families who need help escaping situations the law refuses to address. He has agreed to take Thomas north. They will travel at night, using houses and churches that once sheltered fugitive slaves. The route will take them through Wilmington, then Philadelphia. The journey should take 4 days. I asked Elijah what would happen if they were caught. He looked at me with eyes that had seen more suffering than I could imagine and said, "Mrs. Thornton, I have been caught before. I have been beaten, jailed, and threatened, but I am still here, and so are the 37 children I have helped over the past 40 years. We will not be caught." Rebecca set the letter down. "This Elijah Warren, do we know anything else about him?" Catherine nodded. "After your grandmother told me this story, I did some research. Elijah Warren was real. He died in 1918, and there's a small plaque honoring him at the Bethel AME Church in Baltimore. He helped establish several schools for black children after the Civil War." The next letter detailed the night of Thomas's departure. Constance had told Harold that she was visiting her sister in Philadelphia and would be gone for several days, a common enough occurrence that he had no reason to suspect anything. She arranged for the other children to stay with their aunt. That night, under cover of darkness, Constance brought Thomas to a house near the harbor. The boy carried nothing but a small cloth bundle containing a change of clothes and a loaf of bread. Constance had given him one other thing, a small wooden cross that had belonged to her grandmother. "Remember this," I told him as we waited for Elijah to arrive. "You are not property. You were never property. You are a child of God, and you deserve a life of dignity and freedom." Thomas looked at me with those ancient eyes that had seen far too much suffering for an 8-year-old boy. "Why are you helping me, Mrs. Thornton?" It was the first time he had ever asked me a direct question. I knelt down so we were at eye level. "Because it is right," I said, "and because I should have done it sooner. I am sorry, Thomas. I'm so deeply sorry that I waited this long." He did not respond, but he did not look away either. In that moment, I saw something shift in his expression. Not forgiveness, exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding that not everyone in the world wished him harm. When Elijah arrived, Constance watched them disappear into the darkness of Baltimore's narrow streets. She returned home and waited, her heart pounding with fear and hope in equal measure. For 4 days, she heard nothing. Harold was furious about her unexplained absence, but too proud to show it publicly. The children asked about Thomas, but she deflected their questions with vague answers about him returning to his family. On the 5th day, a telegram arrived from Philadelphia. "Package delivered safely. All is well." Constance collapsed in relief. Harold discovered the truth within hours of Constance's return. He had gone to the stable to give Thomas an order, only to find the quarters empty. When he confronted Constance, she stood in the parlor of their Mount Vernon Place home, the photograph from Mr. Ashford's studio laid out on the table between them. "He is gone," she said simply. "Thomas is in Philadelphia, under the protection of people who will ensure he receives an education and a future. If you attempt to retrieve him, I will take this photograph and my testimony to every newspaper in Baltimore." According to the letters, Harold's reaction was not what Constance had expected. He did not rage or threaten. Instead, he sat down heavily in his chair and put his head in his hands. June 16th, 1901. "Harriet, something in Harold broke yesterday. After our confrontation, he went to his study and remained there for hours. When he emerged, he looked like a man who had aged 10 years. 'You have destroyed this family,' he said to me. 'Not because you freed that boy, but because you have proven that my own wife finds me monstrous.' I wanted to feel sympathy for him, but I could not. 'You are monstrous,' I told him. 'Not irredeemably so, perhaps, but you have done monstrous things. A child, Harold. You kept a child in chains?' He had no answer to that. What answer could there be? The marriage, according to Catherine, never recovered. Harold and Constance remained together for appearances, but they lived essentially separate lives. He continued his textile business. She threw herself into charitable work, legitimately helping children this time, establishing a fund for orphans that operated until the 1930s. Their own children grew up largely unaware of what had happened. Margaret, Elizabeth, and Charles were told that Thomas had been a temporary ward of the family who had been returned to relatives. The truth was carefully buried, the photograph hidden away. "What happened to Thomas?" Rebecca asked, the question that had been building throughout her mother's narrative. Catherine smiled, a real smile this time, breaking through the sadness that had shadowed her face throughout the telling. "That is where the story becomes remarkable." She pulled out a small leather journal, its cover worn smooth with age. Your grandmother kept track of him. Not publicly, Harold could never know, but through letters with Harriet and later through contacts in Philadelphia. She documented everything in this journal. Rebecca opened it carefully. The pages were filled with neat handwriting, dates spanning from 1901 to 1945. July 1901, Thomas enrolled in Friends Select School in Philadelphia. Reports say he's excelling in reading and mathematics. October 1902, Thomas participating in community church programs. Has made friends among the other children. June 1905, Thomas completed elementary education with highest marks. Teachers report he shows particular aptitude for science. September 1908, Thomas accepted to high school. Remarkable achievement given his late start in formal education. The entries continued year after year, chronicling a life reclaimed and rebuilt. Thomas graduated from high school in 1911. He worked his way through Lincoln University, one of the first historically black universities in America, graduating in 1917. He became a teacher, dedicating his life to educating black children in Philadelphia. He married in 1920, Catherine said softly. Had 4 children, became a principal in 1935. He never forgot Constance. They exchanged letters until she died in 1940. Rebecca's hands shook as she read the final entry, dated October 1945. Received word that Thomas passed away peacefully, surrounded by his family. He was 52 years old. In our last correspondence, he told me that he'd forgiven Harold, though he had not forgotten. He said that his life's work, teaching over 1,000 children to read and think for themselves, was the best revenge against those who had tried to deny him an education. He thanked me again for giving him his freedom, though I told him many times that he was always free. I simply helped him claim what was rightfully his. Rebecca closed the journal, tears streaming down her face. Did he ever come back to Baltimore? Once, Catherine said. In 1938, for Constance's 75th birthday. He came quietly, met with her privately. They spent an afternoon together, just talking. Your grandmother saw them. She was 16 at the time, and that was when Constance told her the whole story. Made her promise to keep it secret until everyone involved was gone. Why secret? Rebecca asked. This is a story of courage, of doing the right thing. Because, her mother interrupted gently, it is also a story of shame, of a respected Baltimore family that kept a child in slavery decades after it was abolished. Constance wanted to protect her children and grandchildren from that stain. She thought the truth would hurt the family more than it would help anyone. Rebecca looked at the photograph again, seeing Thomas's face with new eyes. This was not just a historical artifact. It was proof of one woman's courage and one boy's resilience. She was wrong, Rebecca said firmly. This story needs to be told. Rebecca returned to Baltimore with a mission. She contacted the Baltimore Sun, the Maryland Historical Society, and several professors specializing in post-Civil War African-American history. She wanted to tell Thomas's story, but first she needed to find out everything she could about his life and legacy. Dr. James Carter, a historian at Johns Hopkins University, met with her in his cluttered office overlooking the campus. He listened intently as Rebecca explained what she had discovered, occasionally making notes or asking clarifying questions. This is extraordinary, he said when she finished. We know that illegal bondage of black children continued well into the 20th century, but documentation is scarce. Most families destroyed any evidence. The fact that you have the photograph, the letters, and the journal, this is invaluable. Can you help me find out more about Thomas? Rebecca asked. Dr. Carter spent the next 2 weeks diving into archives. He contacted colleagues at Lincoln University, searched Philadelphia newspaper archives, and tracked down census records. What he found exceeded Rebecca's hopes. Thomas had indeed become a prominent educator in Philadelphia. Under the full name Thomas Freeman, a surname he had chosen himself upon arriving in Pennsylvania, symbolizing his freedom, he had taught at 3 different schools between 1917 and 1945. He had been instrumental in developing curriculum that incorporated black history and literature at a time when such subjects were largely ignored in American schools. More remarkable still, many of his former students had gone on to significant achievements. Dr. Carter found records of at least 15 students who had become doctors, lawyers, teachers, and civil rights activists. One, a woman named Dorothy Hayes, had written a memoir in 1968 in which she credited Mr. Freeman with changing her life. He never spoke about his early childhood, Hayes had written, but we all sensed that he understood struggle in a way that went beyond academic knowledge. He taught us that education was not just about learning facts, it was about reclaiming our humanity and shaping our own destinies. Rebecca arranged to travel to Philadelphia. Dr. Carter accompanied her, and together they visited the schools where Thomas had taught. The buildings had changed over the decades, but the communities remembered him. At the Morton School, where Thomas had been principal from 1935 to 1945, they met with the current principal, an elderly woman named Gloria Richardson, who had attended the school as a child in the 1940s. Mr. Freeman was different from other principals. Gloria said, her eyes distant with memory. He knew every student by name. He would walk through the halls and stop to ask about your family, your interests, your dreams. He made you feel like you mattered. Did he ever talk about Baltimore? Rebecca asked. Gloria thought for a moment. Once, I must have been about 10 years old, and I asked him why he became a teacher. He said something I never forgot. Because someone once helped me when I was 8 years old, and I made a promise to myself that I would spend my life helping others the same way. I did not understand what he meant at the time, but I never forgot the look in his eyes when he said it. They visited Thomas's grave at Eden Cemetery, a historic African-American cemetery in Collingdale, Pennsylvania. The headstone was simple. Thomas Freeman, 1893-1945, beloved teacher and father. Standing there, Rebecca felt the weight of everything she had learned. This man, who had been treated as property as a child, had transformed his pain into purpose. He had touched hundreds of lives, creating ripples of change that extended far beyond his own lifetime. We need to tell people about him, Rebecca said. Not just about what was done to him, but about what he became. Dr. Carter nodded. But we also need to tell the full story, including the parts that make us uncomfortable. Constance's courage matters, but so does Harold's cruelty. And we need to acknowledge that there were likely other children like Thomas, whose stories were never documented. Rebecca understood. This was not a simple tale of good versus evil. It was a complex story about a nation still grappling with the legacy of slavery, about the courage it takes to do what is right even when it costs everything, and about the resilience of those who survive and thrive despite unimaginable circumstances. 6 months after finding the photograph, Rebecca stood in the Maryland Historical Society's main gallery. The room was filled with people, historians, educators, community leaders, and journalists, all gathered for the opening of an exhibition titled Thomas Freeman, From Bondage to Legacy. The centerpiece of the exhibition was the 1901 family portrait, enlarged and displayed with careful lighting, that highlighted the details Rebecca had first noticed in her grandmother's attic. Beside it was a timeline documenting Thomas's life, from his years of captivity through his transformation into an educator who had influenced generations. But the exhibition went further. Dr. Carter had helped Rebecca research the broader context, and the display included information about the continuation of illegal child labor and exploitation in the early 20th century, the networks that helped children escape such situations, and the educators like Thomas who had worked to create opportunities for black children in an era of segregation and discrimination. Constance's letters were displayed in climate-controlled cases, her words bearing witness to both the crime and the courage that had changed one boy's life. The journal documenting Thomas's later years showed visitors that this was not just a story about suffering, it was a story about triumph. Rebecca had also tracked down Thomas's descendants. His great-granddaughter, Angela Freeman, had traveled from Atlanta for the opening. She stood beside Rebecca now, looking at the photograph of her great-grandfather as a frightened 8-year-old boy. We grew up hearing stories about how he valued education, Angela said softly. My grandfather would tell us that Thomas used to say, "They can take everything from you except what you know." I understand that now in a different way. A reporter from the Baltimore Sun approached them. Ms. Miller, some people are asking why you decided to reveal this story now. Your family could have continued to keep it private. Rebecca had anticipated this question. She had struggled with it herself during the long months of research and preparation. Because silence protects no one, she said finally. My great-great-grandfather did something terrible. My great-great-grandmother tried to make it right. And Thomas Freeman built a life of meaning from the ashes of his childhood. All of those truths matter. We cannot learn from history if we hide the parts that make us uncomfortable. Angela nodded in agreement. Thomas's life teaches us that even the cruelest circumstances cannot destroy the human spirit. But it also teaches us that we have a responsibility to act when we witness injustice. Constance acted. The question is, would we? The exhibition ran for 3 months, drawing thousands of visitors. Schools brought classes to see it. Local news coverage sparked discussions about Baltimore's complicated history with slavery and its aftermath. The photograph that had been hidden for over a century became a catalyst for honest conversations about race, justice, and legacy. But for Rebecca, the most meaningful moment came on a quiet Tuesday afternoon, 3 weeks after the opening. She was at the exhibition, checking on some details, when a young black girl, maybe 9 or 10 years old, approached her. Are you the lady who found the picture? The girl asked. Yes, I am. My teacher told us about Thomas Freeman. She said he was a slave but became a principal. Is that true? It is true, Rebecca confirmed. The girl studied the photograph intently, her face serious. His wrists have scars. They do, from ropes. He was tied up when he was your age. The girl was quiet for a moment, then she asked, Did it hurt? Rebecca knelt down to the girl's eye level. Yes, I think it hurt very much. But he did not let that pain stop him from becoming someone who helped other children. The girl nodded slowly, absorbing this. My mom says we have to remember history so we can make the future better. Your mom is very wise, Rebecca said. That is exactly why stories like Thomas's matter. As the girl walked away to rejoin her class, Rebecca felt something shift inside her. This was not just about documenting the past. It was about giving people, especially young people, examples of resilience and courage to carry forward. The light was fading in Rebecca's Baltimore apartment as she sat at her desk, surrounded by papers, photographs, and notes. It had been 8 months since she had found the portrait in her grandmother's attic, and her life had changed in ways she never could have anticipated. She had taken a leave of absence from the hospital to work on a book about Thomas Freeman and the hidden history of post-abolition child exploitation. Dr. Carter had agreed to co-author it, and several publishers had expressed interest. More importantly, she had helped establish a scholarship fund in Thomas's name for students pursuing careers in education, a tangible way to extend his legacy into the future. But tonight, Rebecca was focused on something more personal. She had finally received documents from Lincoln University's archives, copies of papers that Thomas had written during his time as a student there. Reading his words, preserved for over a century, felt like hearing his voice directly. One essay, written in 1915 for a philosophy class, made her stop breathing. On the nature of freedom, many believe that freedom is simply the absence of chains. I know differently. I wore chains once, though they were made of rope rather than iron. I felt the weight of bondage, though it was called apprenticeship rather than slavery. But when those physical restraints were removed, I discovered that true freedom is something far more profound. Freedom is the ability to determine one's own path. It is the right to education, to self-improvement, to the pursuit of knowledge without restriction. It is the opportunity to lift others as one climbs. It is the choice to forgive without forgetting, to build rather than destroy, to teach rather than hate. I was 8 years old when a woman I had been taught to obey as my master chose, instead to see me as a child worthy of dignity. That act of moral courage freed both of us, me from bondage, her from complicity and evil. It taught me that freedom is not only claimed but also given, not only individual but also collective. We are all bound together, and none of us is truly free until all of us are. Rebecca read the passage 3 times, tears streaming down her face. This was Thomas's voice, thoughtful, philosophical, generous even toward those who had harmed him. She picked up the photograph, the one that had started everything. In the months since she had found it, she had learned to see past the horror of what it represented and recognize it for what it truly was. Evidence of a turning point, a moment when one person chose courage over complicity. Her phone buzzed. It was a message from Angela Freeman sharing a photo. Angela's daughter, Thomas's great-great-granddaughter, had just been accepted to medical school. The caption read, "He would have been so proud." Rebecca smiled through her tears. This was Thomas's real legacy, not the suffering he had endured, but the lives he had touched and the generations he had influenced. Every student he had taught, every person he had inspired, every descendant who pursued education and helped others, all of it flowed from that moment in 1901 when Constance Thornton had decided that a child's freedom mattered more than her social standing. She thought about the chain of events that had brought her here. Her grandmother's decision to keep the photograph rather than destroy it. Her mother's willingness to break the family silence. Her own choice to dig deeper rather than look away. Truth had its own momentum, she realized. Once unleashed, it could not be contained. Her computer screen showed the first chapter of the book she was writing. She reread the opening lines. This is a story about a photograph taken in Baltimore in 1901. It is also a story about cruelty and courage, bondage and freedom, silence and truth. But most of all, it is a story about a boy named Thomas who was taught that he was property but chose to believe he was human. His choice changed everything. Rebecca saved the document and stood, walking to her window. Baltimore spread out before her. The harbor where Elijah Warren had led Thomas to freedom, the neighborhoods where the Thornton family had once lived, the streets that connected past and present. She thought about all the photographs that existed in attics and albums across America, each one holding stories that someone had tried to bury. She thought about the children like Thomas who had suffered in silence, whose names were never recorded, whose voices were never heard. But she also thought about the Constances and Elijahs, the people who had risked everything to do what was right. They reminded her that moral courage was possible in any era, that one person's choice could change the trajectory of another person's entire life. The photograph of Thomas Freeman would remain in the Maryland Historical Society's permanent collection. School children would see it and ask questions. Historians would study it and find new layers of meaning. And somewhere, perhaps, other people would be inspired to look more carefully at their own family histories, to tell the truth about what they found there, to honor both the suffering and the triumph. Rebecca returned to her desk. She had work to do, a book to finish, a scholarship fund to build, a legacy to honor. But for now, she simply sat with the photograph, with Thomas's 8-year-old eyes looking back at her across 123 years. "Thank you," she whispered to the image, "for surviving, for becoming more than what they tried to make you, for teaching us that our past does not have to define our future." Outside, the sun set over Baltimore, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. The city that had once harbored such cruelty had also produced such courage, and a boy who had once been treated as property had become a teacher whose influence echoed through 5 generations. The photograph remained where Rebecca had placed it, no longer hidden, no longer silent, but finally, after more than a century, bearing witness to the truth.